Hello everyone. I'm Weik von Mossner, and it is a great pleasure to join you here at the Ecomedia in the Anthropocene Symposium. First of all, I want to thank the conference organizers for putting together such a wonderful array of presentations in this innovative and exciting new format, and of course it is a great honor to be one of the plenary speakers. My talk today aims to contribute to the symposium's spirit of innovation by drawing connections between two emerging subfields within ecomedia studies and the environmental humanities more generally, cognitive eco-criticism and vegan studies. Cognitive eco-criticism is a term that was first used by Nancy Easterlin in her 2010 contribution to Lisa Sunshine's Introduction to Cognitive Cultural Studies, where she argued that, from the point of view of eco-criticism, knowledge of human cognitive dispositions is valuable since it can illuminate the relationships between human minds and non-human nature. And of course the same is true for the relationship between human minds and mediated forms of non-human nature. This is why I argue in my Effective Ecologies book that an eco-critical approach that draws on empirical research in cognitive science can give us a better understanding on how we engage on the cognitive and affective level with environmental literature, film, and other ecomedia. Vegan studies is a similarly recent development. In the definition of Laura Wright, it is a field of inquiry that explores veganism as both a practice and an identity, and that seeks to understand and challenge the popular and academic discourses that construct veganism and vegan identity. Wright and other scholars working in the field are acutely aware of the complex emotions that surround veganism, and they are interested in how vegan identity is both constructed and challenged by cultural texts within a mostly non-vegan media landscape. And I believe that is precisely where a cognitive eco-critical approach can usefully complement the cultural studies side of vegan studies by turning our attentions to the ways in which ecomedia texts invite us to feel about animals, food, and the relationship between the two. There is no question that most mainstream media texts do not want us to feel about animals in any particular way. They tend to focus on human relationships and either condone the exploitation of animals by humans or simply take it for granted. And of course, such representations are of great interest to vegan studies scholars precisely for that reason, especially in terms of how they relate food and lifestyle choices to issues of gender, race, class, and sexuality. There are, however, also ecomedia texts that deliberately challenge our exploitative relationships with non-humans and that confront us with what Carol Adams has called traumatic knowledge. Documentary films such as Sean Monson's Earthlings have often been credited for turning people vegan overnight through graphic depictions of animal suffering that induce high levels of empathic distress and eco-horror. More recent releases such as Chris Delfort's Dominion and Christopher Dillon Quinn's Eating Animals use similar visual and narrative strategies to trigger a range of negative and painful feelings in order to encourage viewers to rethink their relationship to non-human animals. But I'm also interested in the other end of the affective spectrum, where we find cookbooks, food blogs, and practical guides that aim to make a vegan lifestyle attractive by engaging us aesthetically and evoking positive emotions, such as pleasure and desire. I want to explore these different effective strategies in different types of ecomedia and comment on their potential usefulness in persuading resistant audience to change their attitudes and behaviors towards non-human others. And I want to do so by using the analytical tools of cognitive eco-criticism. Of particular importance to my recent research has been the concept of embodied simulation as it has been developed by the Italian neuroscientist Vittorio Gallese. In Gallese's definition, embodied simulation is the activation of embodied mechanisms encompassing the simulation of actions, emotions, and corporal sensations, which he relates directly to the mirror neuron system in our brains. So what this basically means is that the same regions in our brains are active regardless of whether we move our own right arm, whether we see somebody else move their right arm. The same regions in our brains will be active, therefore we map the other person's movement onto our own body, and that's embodied simulation. And the same is true, according to Galese, for another person's emotions or corporal sensations as we observe them. I think of particular interest to us as cultural studies scholars, as Wikimedia studies scholars, as literary studies scholars, is the fact that Galese has shown that the same mechanism, embodied simulation, and therefore the mirror neuron system, is also responsible for our understanding of character actions, emotions, and corporal sensations. Because the same thing happens if you watch an actor, for example, move their right arm in a movie, or whether we read about a character in a novel moving their right arm. In all cases, we map that onto our own brains, and therefore it is literally embodied. And in chapter 4 of my Affective Ecologies book, I'm interested in how processes of embodied simulation help us relate to animals in literature and in film via a process that I call trans-species empathy. So the question I'm interested in is whether it is really only anthropomorphism, as has often been claimed, that helps us relate to animals on film, whether it be a Disney film or an environmental documentary such as The Cove, or whether we can actually truly feel empathy across species lines. I'm drawing for that research on critical animal studies as well as cognitive ethology, the study of animal minds, because cognitive ethologists in the last few decades have shown that animals have very rich emotional lives and that they also feel empathy. Researchers such as Frans de Waal and Jacques Panksepp have not only shown that animals do feel empathy within their species and beyond, but they've also called for a cross-species understanding of empathy. For Wikimedia studies scholars, a particularly interesting study is by Robert Franklin et al. On the neural responses to perceiving suffering in humans and animals, which shows that, quote, there are many overlapping regions in humans' empathic responses to viewing animal and human suffering, particularly in areas classically associated with empathic response. Now, the interesting thing about this study is that they used images of human and dog suffering that they pulled from the internet. And while one interesting result of the studies, I think, is that we do actually respond empathetically to both human suffering and dog suffering, the other thing that is interesting is that the researchers used images and therefore representations of human and dog suffering rather than exposing the subjects directly to this suffering. And that, of course, is quite interesting for Wikimedia studies scholars. So what I'm claiming here is that a focus on trans-species empathy allows us to address a question that is of interest to Wikimedia studies scholars, vegan studies scholars, and animal rights activists alike. Why is it that many of us are so strongly affected by the representation of animal suffering in a photograph, in a documentary film, or even in a fiction film, or in a novel? Documentary films such as Monsoon's Earthlings and non-fiction books such as Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals are frequently cited as triggers for people's decision to go vegan. And if you look at this Google representations of Earthlings, we'll see that it is not only classified as documentary here, but also as a horror film, because the film deliberately does cue eco-horror. And horror is what psychologists call a bystander emotion. So it is an emotion that you feel when you're actually witnessing somebody else being in terrible pain or being in terrible danger. It is not an emotion that you feel when you yourself are in danger. That's when you feel terror or fear. Okay? But then the question is whether it is really only horror that we are feeling when we are witnessing animal suffering in a film like Earthlings, or whether it is indeed also fear, and thus an emotion that is related to our own well-being. The cognitive film scholar Julian Hanig has argued that it is indeed also fear that we are feeling when we are watching a horror movie. When we are afraid at the movies, he explains, it is often because we fear a negative affective outcome, namely our own fearful experience of shock and or horror. For example, because we know that the next image, or we expect that the next images are going to be harmful in the sense of showing a lot of gore or blood, and it's going to affect us, or that we're going to experience a startling response. The other aspect that Hanek also mentions is that we are afraid of what it might do to us afterwards. For example, we might dream. We might have bad dreams following the exposure to a horror movie. At least some of us, I guess, do. Others just very much enjoy watching a horror film. And so that aspect, I think, is particularly interesting when we think about a film like Earthlings. So people are not necessarily only afraid of the horror that they will feel when they watch animals suffering, but it is also about their own emotions, their own reaction to the film, both during the exposure to the film and also afterwards, because it is a deeply and deliberately shocking film that shows us what happens in slaughterhouses to animals, that shows us what happens to them in other places when they are skinned half alive or when they are grinded while they are still conscious. So often, of course, there is a pre-existing uneasiness around the consumption of animal products, especially around the consumption of meat, for people who expose themselves to a film like Earthlings. But it seems nevertheless that exposure to shocking representations of animal suffering can add something to those pre-existing concerns, especially when they are so vivid and visceral that they make it difficult for viewers to remain in denial. And psychologists such as Melanie Joy have argued that denial is involved in most people's meat consumption today. If you're like most people, writes Joy, when you sit down to eat beef, you don't envision the animal from which the meat was derived. You avoid that mental connection between meat and the animal, and that is what she calls empathy inhibition. It helps to inhibit your empathy for the animal if you don't make that mental connection between the meat and the animal. So it is a cognitive suppression of an effective empathetic response due to egoistical motives, cultural beliefs, habitualization, or outright denial. And even if people do make the connection between their meat and the animal that dies for it, they do not necessarily want to face the reality of that death. More than 75% of Americans think that they usually eat meat from animals that were treated humanely, but less than 1% of all farmed animals live on non-factory farms. Plus, even if it is a non-factory organic farm, that doesn't necessarily mean that the meat, dairy, and eggs and other animal products are cruelty-free. In fact, most vegans would argue that humane livestock farming is impossible. It's a contradiction in terms. And Joy's book title reminds us of yet another important factor when it comes to our empathetic relationship to animals, namely their species. Cultural belief systems, writes Joy, and the schemas they create in people's mind dictate which animals are edible and enable us to consume them by protecting us from feeling any emotional or psychological discomfort when doing so. So this is what we call speciesism, or what Joy actually calls carnism. You see these two books by Joy and by the psychologist Hal Herzog, both are interested in our different relationships to different species and breeds of animals, and the relation to empathy inhibition, or what Melanie Joy also calls psychic numbing, which leads to a collapse of compassion and to an absence of empathetic distress, which psychologists such as Martin Hoffman consider an important pro-social emotion, A film such as Earthlings tries to push through that apathy, through that empathy inhibition and psychic numbing in order to make us care for the animals, in order to make the connection, as the filmmakers have put it. And they do so by confronting us with traumatic knowledge, which, according to Carol Adams, quote, makes us feel the suffering of animals acutely. It feels relentless. It does not provide relief, but intensifies our emotional connection to animals. This connects in interesting ways to the empirical work done by Wojciech Malecki and collaborators at the University of Wrocław in Poland. In a +1 studies, Malecki et al. Showed that literary fiction influences attitudes towards animal welfare. And in their forthcoming book on human minds and animal stories, Malecki et al. Report the results of another empirical study that clearly indicates that the more violent and cruel the display of animal suffering in a literary story, the stronger the effect on readers' attitudes toward animal welfare. The display of a positive human-animal relationship in a literary text, by contrast, did not have any significant effect on readers' attitudes toward animal welfare. The shocking display of animal cruelty, then, that we find, for example, in Earthlings and many other ecomedia texts that advocate a vegan lifestyle, seems to be quite effective, if indeed one is willing and able to suffer through them and live with the traumatic knowledge. And I would argue that many people are not. Many people perhaps have never heard of the film Earthlings, and many people who do know about it would probably not want to watch it or would get up and stop watching it in the middle of it. So we do have a tendency to withdraw from that kind of traumatic knowledge. On the other hand, for animal rights activists and vegans and other people who deeply care about animals, the reinforcement of their already existing traumatic knowledge that Carol Adams has diagnosed about animal exploitation can be debilitating. So they might need not images of more animal suffering, but actually something that is more uplifting, that is more hopeful, more helping them to carry on. So I think that is why it is important to keep in mind that, as Laura Wright has shown, the animal rights issue is not the only reason why people choose a vegan diet or lifestyle. There are a number of films that choose a different route of argument than Earthlings. For example, a Cowspiracy that focuses on the relationship between meat and climate change, and the films What the Health and Food Choices that both focus on individual health and the advantages of a vegan diet as opposed to a meat-based diet or animal product-based diet. There are also films that try a more hopeful approach, such as Meat the Future and The End of Meat, by focusing on alternatives that come supposedly without a guilty conscience. For example, plant-based meat substitutes or lab-grown clean meat, thus focusing on potential solutions and on the positive emotions related to a diet that doesn't necessitate the killing of animals. One of the most interesting ecomedia texts in that regard is the British Veganuary campaign. Launched in January 2014, Veganuary is a registered charity that encourages people to try vegan for 1 month, the month of January. On its website, the campaign frames veganism as the most effective choice a person can make to reduce the suffering of animals, help the planet, and improve personal health. So it basically makes all three arguments: an animal welfare argument, environmental argument related to climate change, water pollution, air pollution, etc., and a health argument related to personal diet. I first became aware of Veganuary in December 2016 when I saw their campaign ads on Twitter, all of them featuring named baby animals, asking people to try vegan this January. The happy-looking animals are quite typical for the campaign's effective appeal. While you can find images of suffering animals in industrial livestock farming if you specifically look for them on the campaign website, most of the imagery they use is of healthy, happy-looking animals, regardless of whether they ask for your compassion and kindness, as in these examples, or if they question speciesism, as in these examples. The campaign also uses quotations by celebrities such as Joaquin Phoenix and famous authors such as Guy de Maupassant and Ralph Waldo Emerson to ask for people's kindness towards animals and to make uncomfortable comparisons between human motherhood and animal motherhood, as in these examples. Last but not least, there's a strong emphasis on community and cooking. So the idea is that veganism should not be something that is isolating, especially for somebody who's trying it for the very first time, but that actually there are other people trying it at the same time too. It's not any 30-day challenge that we also know from other contexts, but because everybody is doing it in the month of January, there is a community of people who are new to this and who are learning to cook vegan. The images of happy-looking animals are also used for campaign funding and for encouraging people to increase the number of participants in each consecutive year. In 2017, the number they were hoping for January 2018 was 150,000 participants. As it turned out, the campaign grew by 183% that year, with almost 170,000 people signing up to go vegan. What's interesting about the numbers is that women continue to outnumber men when it comes to try a vegan diet, with 84% female compared to 14% male, which clearly demonstrates the gender issues involved in meat consumption. Another interesting aspect revealed by the Veganuary campaign is that there is a range of reasons why people decide to try vegan for 1 month, or why they actually stay vegan after the end of the 30-day challenge. This January, we can read on the campaign website, like previous campaigns, a concern for animal welfare was given as the #1 reason for people registering. That said, health and environment motivations both increased this year, and for the first time ever, their combined total surpassed those choosing animal welfare. Of those who chose the other box, most suggested it was a combination of these reasons, but with other popular responses including "I was dared to take part" and "to make my partner happy." These last two statements highlight the importance of the communal aspect of the campaign, as does the sharing of vegan recipes among participants, which we can find featured on the campaign website. And this brings me to the last point I want to make today about how Ecomedia texts cue positive emotions in order to advocate a vegan lifestyle. I'm referring to the dozens, if not hundreds, of cookbooks and food blogs that were published in recent years with the aim to make plant-based food attractive, desirable, and appetizing by using what has been called vegan food porn. In an article in The Atlantic entitled "What Food Porn Does to the Brain," the journalist Carrie Rom cites psychologist Deirdre Barrett's research on supernormal stimuli and her insight that exaggerated imitation can cause a stronger pull than the real thing. Food porn has been defined in part by the senses, in that it is a visual experience of something that other people can smell and taste. And so just like our negatively connoted imaginary experience of the suffering of animals, the appreciation and desiring of alluring representations of food is dependent on processes of embodied simulation. Vision, explains Galese, is far more complex than the mere activation of the visual part of the brain. Vision is multimodal. It encompasses the activation of somatosensory, emotion-related, and motor brain networks. These play out in endocrine systems. The multimodality of vision allows for the activation of a wide range of other physical responses, allowing us to simulate on the imaginary level a range of sensual impressions that we do not perceive directly, among them, for example, smell, taste, and texture of food. Sight is critical in eating, agrees Barb Stuckey in her book-length study on taste, and this is the case even when the food is physically present. In the case of food porn, however, the supranormal stimulus of a carefully arranged and lit dish, which may or may not be edible, can be even more powerful and emotionally engaging than the actual stimulus on your dinner table. Now, there's no question that this can be problematic, since there's research on cooking shows, for example, that demonstrates that watching a cooking show and enjoying it does not necessarily lead to more cooking at home. It may just lead to you really enjoying watching cooking shows. But nevertheless, there is something to be said for food porn in vegan food blogs and in cookbooks. In her contribution to an edited collection on critical perspectives on veganism, Ophélie Véran observes that early vegan food bloggers in France intended to provide like-minded people with information that at the time was difficult to get, and that over the past decade, quote, "this vegan blogosphere has helped build and develop the identity of the French vegan community." In addition to helping create a sense of identity and community among like-minded people that we have also seen in the Veganuary campaign in Great Britain, Véran credits food blogging with expanding the acceptance of veganism in French society more generally through highlighting the culinary delights offered by the vegan cuisine and presenting it in a way that is attractive and alluring. As we have seen then, processes of embodied simulation play a central role not only in our empathetic engagement with suffering animals in documentary films such as Earthlings, or in our empathetic enjoyment of Ecomedia text showing animals that look happy and healthy. It is just as important in evoking positive emotions such as aesthetic pleasure and desire in relation to vegan food choices, community, and a vegan lifestyle more generally. The emotions we feel in response to images and narratives are real. That is important to remember, even as the experiences that produce them are mediated and imaginary. So there is no question that there is a qualitative difference between a personal experience where we are physically present and a mediated experience that we have when we read a novel or watch a film. But when it comes to how things are processed and stored in our brains, that difference may not be as big as we think. The neuroscientist Jeffrey Sachs has shown that whether we experience events in real life, watch them in a movie, or hear about them in a story, we build perceptual and memory representations in the same format. That is why, Sachs explains in his book, some people cannot even remember whether something that happened, let's say 10 years ago, whether they actually lived through that themselves or whether they saw it in TV or in a movie. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is that strong emotional experiences tend to stick with us, regardless of whether that was an imaginary experience, a mediated experience, or whether it was a personal experience. And that might influence our decision months or years later. My argument here hasn't necessarily been that one of these effective strategies is more successful than the other one, or that evoking aesthetic pleasure and desire is necessarily better than cueing negative emotions such as empathetic distress, horror, disgust, guilt, and shame. If we want to work against the collapse of compassion and lack of care towards farm animals and other non-humans that marks our time, then we probably need a combination of effective approaches across a range of ecomedia communications. What we also need, I believe, is more empirical research, eco-critical empirical research that investigates the effects of narrative strategies and techniques of ecomedia texts with the kind of depth and nuance that eco-critics have brought to their research for decades, rather than just straightforward social science or communications research. There are so many questions still open when it comes to our empathetic and emotional responses to environmental narratives. Cognitive eco-criticism, I believe, can offer us a first step towards understanding better how we respond emotionally to animal narratives and other environmental narratives in a range of ecomedia texts. But the next step, I think, should be to incorporate more and more empirical research with an eco-critical bent. Thank you very much for watching.